Hi, it's Matt. This is the second video in the Responsible Engineering series. If you haven't had a chance to look at the Introduction to Responsible Engineering, please watch that one first and then come back to this one. In this one, we will look at the four schools of thought that we can use in TechCom to analyze ethical dilemmas. So I will start the presentation now. Introduction to Selected Schools of Thought for Engineering Ethics. So first of all, what is a school of thought? Is that a school where everybody thinks the same or learns how to think? Maybe a school like this, where you might get flogged if you disagree with the schoolmaster. This is Tom Sawyer, by the way. No, it is not that type of school. So a school of thought suggests a specific way of thinking about an ethical dilemma. When you apply a school of thought strictly, you may feel uncomfortable or you may be inspired. You may think of something that you hadn't thought of before. You can apply various schools of thought to any ethical dilemma, and that can give you a way to start the process of making a difficult decision. A school of thought is not intended to give you the right choice when you face an ethical dilemma. It's intended to, as I said in the first sentence, to suggest a specific way of thinking about an ethical dilemma. So a school of thought offers one perspective on an ethical dilemma, but it's up to you to evaluate that perspective and include it or not in your overall moral judgment. Okay, so these are the different schools of thought that we're going to look at today. There are many others that philosophers have discussed over the years. But the four we're going to look at, and I think they're very useful for engineering, are deontology, utilitarianism, consequentialism, and rights. So deontological ethics judges the morality of an action based on the action's adherence to a rule or rules. The word deontology comes from the Greek. The word deon means obligation or duty. So when we think about deontological ethics, we're thinking about following rules and doing our duty. And according to deontological ethics, if we follow the rules and we do our duty, we are acting ethically. And that's the only thing that deontology considers. So it's about rules, laws, and regulations. So for class discussion, when we talk about this in our normal class, if you maybe take a note on this, can you think of a situation where simply obeying the rules is the most ethical choice? Sometimes obeying the rules is not the most ethical choice, but there can be situations where a strict deontological approach could be the best choice, the most ethical choice. If you can think of a situation like that, I'd like to discuss it in class. Here's further reading from Stanford University about deontological ethics. Consequentialism is the second school of thought that we'll look at, and this philosophy holds that the consequences of one's conduct are the ultimate basis for any judgment about the rightness or wrongness of that conduct. Thus, from a consequentialist standpoint, a morally right act is one that will produce a good outcome or consequence. This could be summarized, and it's easier to remember if you think of it as the end justifies the means. You've probably heard people say that. It essentially means that no matter if a goal is morally important enough, any method of achieving it is acceptable according to this philosophy. Obviously, that comes with some real risks and drawbacks, to say the least. But according to consequentialism, the outcome is what counts and nothing else. I have some quotes here. When I Googled consequentialism, I saw a bunch of these quotes from A to Z quotes. I'm not offering any judgment on the quotes. Most of these are critical of consequentialism, if not all of them. But we just take a look just for fun. The first sign of corruption in a society that is still alive is that the end justifies the means. George Bernanos. I'm sorry I have not, or Georges Bernanos. I'm sorry I do not know who he is. He sounds French. The end justifies the means, but what if there never is an end? All we have is means. Ursula Guin. The principle that the end justifies the means is in individualist ethics regarded as the denial of all morals. In collectivist ethics, it becomes necessary it becomes necessarily the supreme rule. That's Hayek. He is a philosopher. I'm familiar with him. The end cannot justify the means for the simple and obvious reason that the means employed determine the nature of the ends produced. Aldous Huxley is an author. Does the end justify the means, or should it be, do the ends justify the mean? Do the extremes justify moderation? In this context, the word mean, I believe, refers to the average. The end may justify the means as long as there is something that justifies the end. I personally find that confusing. That seems like a philosophy with no end because something has to justify the something and so on and so forth. This is by Leon Trotsky. I had heard of him, but I was not very familiar with his history. I looked up his Wikipedia page and I put it in the links to this presentation. He was a Russian revolutionary, to it's long story short. Utilitarianism is the third school of thought that we will consider, and it states that the best action is the one that maximizes utility. Utility can be defined in various ways, but it's usually in terms of the well-being of sentient entities such as human beings and other animals. Utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism, and utilitarianism considers all interests equally. The founder, Jeremy Bentham, described utility as the sum of all pleasure that results from an action minus the suffering of anyone involved in the action. So essentially what you are doing in utilitarianism, if you choose to apply utilitarianism to an ethical dilemma, you are essentially weighing the bad versus the good. And if the good outweigh the bad, then the choice is ethical. If the bad outweigh the good, the choice is unethical. There's no statement about the magnitude. So if a tremendous amount of good barely outweighs a tremendous amount of bad, according to utilitarianism, it's still good, even if there's a great deal of suffering, but the pleasure, as he calls it, is incrementally more, then it's still good, according to this philosophy. This can also be thought of as a cost-benefit analysis, and I think that is a good way of thinking about it. When you do a cost-benefit analysis, or really when you weigh things against each other, you do have to have some form of quantification or a means of comparison. This is something we will look at throughout the semester, and in terms of the project proposal, we'll always want to know, how do we measure things? How do we measure problems, and how do we measure potential solutions? The same goes for a cost-benefit analysis. We need to have common units of measure so the costs can be compared to the benefits. Rights is the fourth school of thought that we'll look at, and rights are principles of freedom or entitlement. They are rules about what is allowed of people or owed to people according to some legal system, social convention, or ethical theory. And there are different sources of rights. I listed a few here. They can be laws, religious texts, founding documents of a country such as the American Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, natural rights, legal rights, international agreements like the UN, European Court of Human Rights, etc. I think it's worth us taking an extra close look at the American Constitution since we are in the United States. We have a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and the founders believed in God and they believed in natural rights. And regardless of whether you feel that way, it does have some validity and some importance for us today. And I think it's worth a separate presentation on that. So we will do that. This building is the it's the European Court of Human Rights. It's in Strasbourg, France. That's on the border between. It's a city that's gone back and forth between France and Germany over the years. Over history, usually as a result of somebody losing a war. But right now it's in France. And will stay in France, assuming. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia. This is a view in the early 19th century. And obviously it's before they put the clock tower. There's now a clock tower on top of this. So this is what it looked like in the early 1800s. This is what it looks like today. Of course, I'm sure you've all been there. If you haven't, you should go. It's a very interesting place. This painting depicts the signing of the of the Constitution. You can see Benjamin Franklin's here sitting up front. I assume this is George Washington and the other founders who signed the Constitution. So we're going to review. Let's review quickly the four schools of thought. We have deontological, where essentially you obey the rules and do your duty, and you're ethical regardless of the consequences. Consequentialism is a different approach where the ends justify the means. As long as the outcome is good, it doesn't matter how you got there, even if you were very unethical. As long as the final outcome was good, then you were ethical, according to consequentialism. Utilitarianism, good minus bad. We're essentially doing a mathematical analysis. If the good outweighs the bad, then you're good to go. Rights, freedom or entitlement according to a system of law or document, including the American Constitution. So what are the schools of thought good for? The way I think of schools of thought are they give you permission to examine ethical dilemmas from several perspectives. If you're faced with an ethical dilemma where people's lives are at risk, or people's rights are at risk, or there's a possibility of people being injured, really serious ethical dilemmas, sometimes it could be difficult to even know where to start to make a decision. So if you feel stuck and you feel overwhelmed about an ethical dilemma, you can apply the school of thought, free from your own conscience, and just ask what the school of thought would tell you, and it gives you a place to start. But you have to take the results seriously, no matter how outrageous or inappropriate they may seem at first. It allows you to just take a step back and examine them from these known perspectives. You still have, of course, you still retain the ability, the responsibility, and the obligation to make the final judgment, but the school of thought can suggest a way forward, especially if you're feeling a little bit confused about a dilemma. You can also use schools of thought to explain your choices to others, or to enable communication between people who are finding it difficult to communicate. Sometimes in an ethical dilemma, there will be people who have much different views, opposing views, and they may shut down and stop talking to each other. But if you suggest going through kind of like an exercise, apply the schools of thought, it can get the conversation going again. So here are several mini cases. I actually want to go through these during class time. I'm going to go through them now, but I'm not going to say much about them. And then when we have class, we can talk about them in class. So in this case, Ella is an engineer. She's licensed in Pennsylvania, and she's retained by an attorney in Pennsylvania to evaluate a large piece of equipment that failed in an industrial plant. Might be for insurance reasons, for example. There is a pending legal action before the state courts. Following the equipment failure, the owner moved the equipment to a different warehouse in New Jersey, but Ella is not licensed in New Jersey. She's not. Some engineers can be licensed, especially if you're going to testify in court, and she is not licensed in New Jersey. Would it be ethical for Ella, who is not licensed in New Jersey, to inspect equipment in New Jersey? She's already been hired. She's licensed in Pennsylvania, and then she's surprised to learn that the equipment was moved to New Jersey. The customer who hired her to do this inspection probably didn't think about the consequences of that, didn't think about her licensure. So would it be ethical for her to simply continue on and do the inspection in New Jersey even though she's not licensed? So then we look at it from different ways: for the rules-based, the consequences, utilitarianism, balancing good versus bad, and rights. Are anybody's rights at risk, or does anybody have specific rights in this situation? Here's another one. You'll burn your brain out, kid. Andrew, the engineer, works for a cellular phone manufacturing company. On his own time, he did some research about the hazards of radiation to the human brain. He later learned that the company's best-selling phone had an SAR to the brain of 35 watts per kilogram. SAR, I believe, stands for specific absorption rate, and it's measured in watts per kilogram. So, yeah, he becomes concerned, and he suggested to his boss Diane that they modify the antennas on the phones and maybe even recall the ones they already sold. Diane is not impressed with this suggestion. She says that would cost the company millions. It's our fastest selling product. Recalling it would be a disaster, and there are more important things to be done. You don't even know if it's dangerous, she said. So has Andrew fulfilled his ethical obligations? He told the manager of his concerns. He suggested a path forward. She chose not to follow his suggestion. Has he fulfilled his ethical obligations, or is there any other information that you'd like before judging Andrew? So again, we can look at it from the different perspectives. So if you could just practice applying the schools of thought to each one of these, maybe make a few notes on the ones that on a few of these items, and then we can talk about it in class. Next mini case, inside job. Medtor is a manufacturer of medical devices. When they need new tooling, the normal process is for in-house engineers to design the tooling. Outside vendors then compete to produce the design at the best terms. However, MedTerm also has an internal tool and die department. In the past, this department was mostly used to sharpen and repair existing tools. However, the department was recently granted permission to also bid on such tooling, to make new tooling. But then Jimmy Jig Williams, manager of the internal tool department, called the purchasing department and asked for the prices obtained from outside vendors before he submits his quote. Okay, that might be a little bit confusing. Medtor normally asks outside vendors to manufacture new tools that they need. Their engineers design the tools, but they are actually produced by outside vendors. Now, an internal department at Medtor will also compete to produce those. So they will have to produce them at a lower cost than the outside vendors. So they're in competition with outside vendors. However, the manager of this department asked for the quotes that they received from outside vendors before he submits his quote. So obviously that gives him inside information. And then he knows, since he knows what prices the outside vendors are charging, he can make his quote lower. So is there anything wrong with him doing that? Is there anything unethical about Jimmy asking for this information? How should the purchasing department respond? And again, we can look at it from different ways. Okay. Here are some links to some interesting, as I was doing research for this presentation, I found some links on different things. This A to Z quotes, I had never heard that before. That was the one of the quotes about the consequentialism. Looks like a really good website. Jeremy Bentham was an interesting person. He was born in the 1740s, and he's known as the founder of utilitarianism. This guy seemed to be a very progressive person, especially for his time. He called for the abolition of slavery, capital punishment, and physical punishment, including that of children. He was an early advocate of animal rights. He did oppose the idea of natural law, which would make him in disagreement with the founders of the United States. So he may be an interesting... this is a good part. On his death in 1832, Bentham left instructions for his body to be first dissected and then to be permanently preserved as an auto-icon or self-image, which would be his memorial. Okay, so they actually dissected his body and then set it up so people could look at it. Kind of crazy. So I have a link for that as well. The head did not turn out well. If you Google Jeremy Bentham auto icon, you'll see the head. It's very shrunken and misshapen. But evidently, this is his skeleton underneath here, and they stuffed this with straw and other things to give it mass and give it shape. So he donated his body to science and he allowed them to dissect it and try and recreate his image. Thought that was kind of interesting. What else do we have here? There's some links on deontology, consequentialism. Here's Leon Trotsky. Several of the cases that I used were adapted from this website. This is the specific absorption rate of radiation. This is from the FCC. Some of you may have heard about the dangers of radiation from cell phones. If you're constantly holding a cell phone up to your head, that you could be absorbing radiation in your brain or other parts of your body. This is the FCC website about that. So that risk, one way of measuring it is the specific absorption rate. Okay, and it's measured in watts per kilogram. If this is interesting for you, this may lead you to a project proposal topic. This could be a place to start. I think the key sentence here is the FCC limit for public exposure from cellular telephones is an SAR of 1.6 watts per kilogram. Okay. Keep clicking on the wrong one. All right. Weiss Aug. This was a company I visited before the pandemic. In the case study where we talked about bear with me. The case study when we talked about the tool and die and the company competing when they need new tooling. They design it and then it's produced by an outside vendor. This is the type of outside vendor. This is an example of an outside vendor who would do that type of tooling. They make all types of metal stampings and moldings. It's a very impressive operation. They have a lot of equipment, a lot of automation there. So these are examples of very tiny parts that they might make. And they could make millions of these parts at a time. The process of making these is very in-depth, requires a tremendous amount of engineering. They have to figure out the most efficient way of stamping something. They have something called dies. They make dies for their customers, and then the customer actually owns the die that they make for them. If we just Google tool and die, we see the same thing. These are examples of dies and tooling. So a die like this, I've never seen this die before, but a die like this might be used to make a very small part that you would find in a consumer device, for example. They might need a die and a tool like this to bend the small part in various shapes, stamp it in various ways, and then you get a finished part. And this is a description of a cost-benefit analysis from Investopedia. A cost-benefit analysis is a process businesses use to analyze decisions. Okay, that's it. So we will talk about these things, especially these cases. These cases, I definitely would like to talk about them in class. So if you could just think about those, maybe take a few notes, and then when we have class, we can discuss them together. Okay, thanks. That's all for now. Bye.